This lecture is to support your study in week 4 of Pol 2 PPE, How Do Societies and Economies Interact? Competing Approaches to Political Economy. And we're now into the week on neoclassical economics, having already looked at classical political economy and Marxian political economy. And as with our previous study in the weeks prior to this, we're going to take a three-pronged approach. We're going to first of all look at the problem to which the neoclassical economists were trying to respond, how they formulated their problem, just as we did with the classical economists and the Marxian economists. We're going to try and grapple with how they conceptualized their problem. Then we're going to articulate their response. And finally, we're going to apply Stilwell's questions to theory development itself and ask who gains, who loses, and does it matter? So let's turn to the problem as the neoclassical economists conceptualized it. You'll notice that on the very first slide for this lecture, I actually selected quite similar images to those that I chose to depict the problem to which Marx was responding. And that's because the first neoclassical economists like Alfred Marshall, William Stanley Jevons in Britain, and elsewhere across Europe, Menger and Pareto, these were economists who developed what's now called the marginal utility approach. And these economists were actually writing just after Marx's period. So there was a big overlap between their contexts. And it means that the problem to which Marx was attempting to respond, and the images that I chose last week to reflect that, were also shared by the neoclassical economists. They were also concerned with the impoverishment of the working classes and the rise of the social ills accompanying industrialisation in Britain. This was a period where the Industrial Revolution was now in full swing. Cities were growing. Populations were moving from rural areas to take part in industry. We saw a growth in the relative prosperity of the upper middle classes, and across the 19th century, an increase in consumerism, at least in the upper middle classes and nobility, because really consumer markets for goods for working class families were incredibly small. One's family still had to produce shoes, clothes. They had to make their own meals and produce as a whole range of goods that we are now able to consume in markets. So consumerism was growing mainly among the upper middle classes and nobility, but not amongst the working class. And so we also saw an increasing inequality, terrible poverty for the working classes, destitution, disease, malnourishment, high birth rates, and then high infant mortality rates, adult mortality through accidents in factories, childhood labour, and family destitution at incredible levels, family breakdown through either the loss of the male breadwinner, through accident or illness, or through desertion. And with these problems, we saw the increasing politicisation of ordinary working class people, the rise of trade unions, the persuasive strength of socialism over people's minds. Interestingly, Alfred Marshall, the forefather of neoclassical economists, whose text you'll read today, for this week, was strongly influenced by socialism and by British idealism, and was very attracted to socialism, particularly cooperative socialism, as a young man. So this is the period in which the early neoclassical economists are writing. On pages 154 to 156 of Stilwell's book, Political Economy, which you are also asked to read for this week, Stilwell considers why neoclassical theory emerged at the end of the 19th century. And he points to 4 different reasons. First, he notes that the actors who most benefited from freer markets wanted to defend them. The capitalist class benefited the most. They secured raw goods from the colonies. They owned the machines. They paid labour a wage. And they enjoyed the profits of selling finished goods to new consumer markets, including back to the colonies themselves. Secondly, according to Stilwell, there was a perceived need to provide an antidote to Marx. As I've said, socialism for this period was a realistic political option. There was a lot of interest, widespread interest in the socialist cooperative movement. Robert Owen, one of the most renowned cooperative thinkers, whose work was at the root of the Rockdale Pioneer Equitable Society of Cooperative Pioneers, founded in 1844, was immensely popular. And he'd been pioneering new communities in America too. New Harmony and others, where cooperation, both in production and in consumption, would be the basis for a new utopian society. So much interest in this at the time. And so there was a perceived need to provide an antidote to Marx in particular, but also to test the practical viability of these new cooperative ideas. And so the market became viewed by the neoclassical economists as a neutral means to distribute wealth, independent of the sorts of ethical value judgments that they believed were inherent in Marx and in Marxist approaches and in socialist accounts. Thirdly, there was a purely intellectual and theoretical interest in overcoming perceived limitations with the labour theory of value. We saw that the classical political economists and Marxian political economists viewed value, the value of goods, as primarily grounded in labour, in how much labour and what quality and quantity of labour went into producing that good. But the neoclassical economists thought that this didn't make sense of the demand side considerations of value. So something might have value independently of how much labour went into it, because people wanted it. So the idea of willingness to pay for something became viewed as an important component of value, and not just the amount of labour that went into its production. So these perceived limitations with the labour theory of value were also being explored theoretically by the neoclassical economists. And finally, the new classical or neoclassical framework resonated with other moral thinking both about the need to maximise utility and also about the need to avoid the purportedly problematic ethical value judgments present in Marxist and socialist accounts. There was the problem was conceptualized by the neoclassical economists as trying to avoid moral judgments about who should get what that were viewed as compromising the ability of markets to spontaneously work well, to function well. Those are the four. Those are the four reasons that we find in Stilwell's account of why neoclassical economics emerged at the end of the 19th century. These considerations led the early neoclassical economists, so Stilwell argues, to understand their problem as a theoretical and scientific project. How might ethical value judgments be avoided in economic analysis so as to achieve a science of motives, a science of preferences, a science of incentives? Certainly we can see why Stilwell wants to present neoclassical economists as trying to avoid ethical value judgments in economics. Marxian views were viewed as partisan and not sufficiently objective. Marx was increasingly viewed as favouring coercive transfers of economic resources to the working class by means of reorganising the ownership of the means of production. Coercive because inconsistent with the idea of economic liberty. Coercive because favouring proletarian dictatorship, according to the neoclassical economists at least. And this language is immediately political and ethical. So when the neoclassical economists came to formulate their own objectives, even though they were facing the same problems, it became formulated without that explicitly ethical and political language, simply as a question of understanding allocation through markets. So the problem was, how might ethical value judgments be avoided to achieve a science of motives, preferences and incentives, conceptualized around how to understand who gets what, why, and so forth. This problem of allocation is very clear in the work of Marshall's, Jevons and others from this period, and they really do want to avoid ethical value judgments in economic analysis. Jevons, for example, says things like, we should only be including objective judgments consistent with a science, and nothing subjective about what people think are right and wrong. So you might choose the values that are important to allow you to begin any science whatsoever about how to measure, what to measure, a scale of measurement and so forth. But you shouldn't be including anything about who should get what, because that's inherently moral and ethical, at least in the way Jevons explains this. So we can see why neoclassical economists has mostly been presented as being concerned with the problem of allocation and the problem of understanding economic analysis as a science of motives, preferences and incentives. However, it's also important to grapple with the way in which neoclassical economics itself was a response to a social and political problem, which the economists also accepted as their own. And here I would like to emphasize this even more than Frank Stilwell does in the chapter that I asked you to read. This is something that I've looked at in some detail myself in a book that's currently in press called Economics in the Family, A Social and Political History, to be published later this year, I hope, with Cambridge University Press. So it's in press now. In that book, in the chapters where I look at the early neoclassical economists, including Marshall and Pareto and others, I show how this theoretical project concerned with allocation and a science of motives, preferences and incentives really only emerged because of how the neoclassical economists formulated their problem. It was a social and political problem too. They conceptualized poverty as caused by institutionalized charity. They believed that both the old poor laws and the new poor laws in Britain were responsible for causing impoverishment. Across all of the neoclassical economists of this period, Leon Voros, and Vilfredo Pareto in Europe, Alfred Marshall and William Stanley Jevons in England, and others, we see a rejection of the provision of institutionalized charity, as they put it, or poverty relief. So this problem of urban impoverishment under industrial conditions and the purported moral evils associated with impoverishment was viewed by the neoclassical economists in the late 19th century as caused by the provision of public charity. Public charity was the problem. Welfare was the problem. So the theoretical project was also a social and political one. This was an argument against the provision of public charity for families. So markets were meant to resolve urban impoverishment spontaneously. And this is why Alfred Marshall describes Thomas Robert Malthus's essay on population as the first modern treatment of population in relation to poverty. We can see why and how Malthus might be a ground here for the neoclassical approach. Markets are meant to resolve urban impoverishment spontaneously by producing more, by distributing this efficiently, by spontaneously leading to increased salaries and improved standards of living. So a little background here. Up until 1834, public charity to assist with the obvious destitution of families across rural and increasingly urban locations, public charity was provided by parishes in Britain under the old poor laws. These had been around since 1601, when the Elizabethan Act for the Relief of the Poor came in, also known as the Old Poor Laws. And this had instituted the first national system for the relief of paupers in England and Wales, replacing earlier forms of church-based charity with a more comprehensive system of parish-administered relief, funded with compulsory land taxes. And these were the laws in operation when Malthus wrote the essay on population that you read in the week on classical political economy. And what was novel about that act was the way it publicly instituted and enforced a notion of family responsibility, with conditions placed on the receipt of relief. And here I follow Melinda Cooper's work on the family. So it compelled families now to provide relief, but it then assigned responsibility to parishes in those cases where relief was not forthcoming. However, by the end of the 1800s, when Malthus wrote, the provision of public relief was had been diluted through all of these different forms of parish provision. And Malthus believed that the old poor laws were incentivising the having of children by those who could not afford to feed them. Across the early 1800s, this idea became increasingly present in public discourse, and the economists who were commissioned to write the Poor Law Commissioner's Report were influenced by Malthus and by Jeremy Bentham, and they argued that the old poor laws incentivised families to have children and increased poverty, and so they advocated for a reform of the poor laws. And this led to the new poor laws coming in 1834. And instead of providing public relief through outdoor charity distributed through the parishes, we instead see public relief being provided through the workhouse system. This is indoor relief through institutionalised charity. Although Malthus himself did not really end up supporting the workhouses, his work was very much accepted as by the public as a ground for the change. So the new poor laws that came about made it necessary for destitute families to live in workhouses and receive public relief conditional upon them working. And this was meant to disincentivise the having of children by those who could not afford to keep them. So families were viewed as primarily responsible for their own destitution. Pareto too thinks that families should even anticipate economic decline in future times having less children so that they can support them through famine and so forth. So families are now depicted in this period as responsible for their own poverty. So neoclassical economists like Marshall, Pareto, Jevons and others rejected even these new poor laws because they felt that even these encouraged the poor to have children that they could not afford to keep, to feed. So it was very much an argument against welfare and responses to destitution, an attempt to incentivize merit and hold families themselves accountable for providing for their family's well-being. So to summarize then, the theoretical problem about how to avoid ethical value judgments in economic analysis so as to achieve a science of motives, preferences and incentives really came about precisely because the economists formulated this social and political problem as the urban family poverty that they saw caused by institutionalized public charity. That was their interpretation of their problem. And we cannot really understand early neoclassical economics without understanding how they formulated their problem in this way. So really the problem was still similar to Marx's. It was how to respond and explain the rising social ills accompanying Britain's Industrial Revolution, but in such a way that one avoided controversial ethical value judgments about who should get what. They thought Marx didn't do that. They thought the socialist cooperatives didn't do that either. But really, withdrawing the use of public charity to assist the destitute was thus viewed by the early neoclassical economists as itself non-political and merely scientific. This is not really how economists tend to view their own history today of neoclassical economics, but I've argued for this in my book. Let's consider now how the problem of neoclassical economics is traditionally conceptualised. And this is nicely defined by William Barber in your readings. So the main argument in that text, as I understand it, is that the problem of neoclassical economics should be viewed as an attempt to explain how the market allocates an economy's resources. The assumption is that if economics is to avoid introducing controversial interpersonal comparisons of utility or ethical judgments about who should get what, then all economics can really do is study how markets themselves spontaneously allocate resources. We note that this is different to the classical tradition, which was primarily concerned with how to increase agricultural production and nascent industrial production, and why mercantilism should be rejected, and why forms of remnant feudalism should also be rejected. And we notice it's also different to the Marxist tradition, which was primarily concerned with how to organise production so that all workers could develop their distinctly human qualities through ownership of the means of production and through cooperative democratic organisation of the economy. So a very different way of doing economics here. An idea of economics as studying how markets themselves spontaneously allocate resources independently of in independence of the sorts of controversial ethical judgments about who should get what that the neoclassical economists thought were present in other competing approaches. The text that you're asked to read this week by Barber also deals with why neoclassical economists shifted their focus in this way. Well, there were changes in the economic environment of Western societies, of global North societies. Production had increased well beyond the expectations of the classical economists. You might recall that in the week on classical economics, we saw that Malthus had theorised that the agricultural production would only increase at 1 additional unit per 25 years, whereas population would increase exponentially, doubling itself every 25 years. But under industrial conditions, 100 years later, production had certainly increased well beyond the expectations of the classical political economists. There was no longer as much of a need to focus on increasing production. in part because markets had now opened. They were more free. One was able to import grain from other countries so that one could then focus the British resources on those industries in which Britain had a comparative advantage. Industry. So through this global economy, the global north economies had enjoyed a prosperity in unprecedented measures without the checks anticipated by the classical and Marxian traditions. There were also observable improvements in real wages, which also seemed to be associated with increases in production. In the Victorian era, it appeared that increases in productive output could indeed service its population's needs. So the problem became one about allocating, concerned with understanding how markets allocate economic resources, to understand the spontaneous and natural functioning of markets, with the market seen as the panacea for poverty. So there's an obvious attempt in the formulation of the problem then to avoid value judgments in favour of scientific and objective understandings, even if I'm suggesting that there was also a very deeply social and political context to the development of this theory. So in sum, according to Barber, the problem was the analysis of the allocative properties of a market system. So now we can turn to part 2. The response. How did the neoclassical economists, and how do they still today, understand allocation? Well, an analysis of economic behaviour. They provide an analysis of economic behaviour that focuses on its decision-making units, households, firms and industries, and on the ways in which choices made by their economic agents are converted into an orderly process. As Stilwell and Argyris put it, neoclassical economics theorises markets as mechanisms for reconciling the objectives of buyers and sellers, leading to the establishment of prices, which act as signals for all economic agents and ensure a more or less efficient allocation of resources. So key elements of this response, and you're asked to read these texts today in the Stilwell and Argyris reader that's selected the readings for this week. We find the key elements in the work of Alfred Marshall and Milton and Rose Friedman. So Alfred Marshall, our first element is to explain how the market allocates resources in a manner that reflects people's wants and preferences, an account of why people act as they do. They're conceptualised as individuals with wants and preferences endowed with rationality. And these wants and preferences are defined by the law of diminishing marginal utility. We have rationality at the margins, marginal purchase, the idea that agents, you and me, we make decisions based on what we can do with an extra dollar, how we will spend that, what the value of that is to us. And there's a view of willingness to pay as a reflection of the strength of preferences. There's also a theory of how supply and demand interact to permit price equilibrium. But we should note, though, that Marshall's family economics also encompasses an argument about how the role of families should be understood and how economies should be structured to support improved labour productivity by families. And if you'd like to read a little more on that, have a look at my article in the Cambridge Journal of Economics on Alfred Marshall's family economics. As for more recent neoclassical theorists like Milton and Rose Friedman, we find here an account of how price theory can explain who gets what, which is now broken down into an account of how much is produced, how much is sold, how much is bought. Price organises this by fulfilling 3 functions. It transmits information, it provides incentives, it distributes economic resources. And this distribution must be accepted, or else we run the risk of undermining the first 2 functions. Students who've studied Pol 1 PPE will already have read Milton and Rose Friedman's text on this. And we will now turn to a brief explanation of those elements with which PPE students will already be familiar, but with which we still need to revise for those who have not yet studied this before. Although Pol 1 PPE students will have already studied the material on this slide and on the next, it's still necessary to recap this so that those who haven't studied it can follow. So neoclassical economists conceptualise the market as the locus of voluntary cooperation. A good example of voluntary cooperation is if you buy ice cream because you want it and someone else supplies that ice cream because they profit from it. And it's voluntary because both parties choose to buy and sell without being coerced into doing so. And neoclassical economists conceptualise this as cooperative too, because the exchange is in the interests of both parties. It's mutual interest. If you compare this to a command economy, and the neoclassical economists would describe the Marxian political economic approach as advocating for a command economy would be one in which a central authority chooses the right products to be made and the right amounts at the right prices. Let's look briefly at how the market allocates in a manner that reflects people's wants and preferences, according to the neoclassical economist. Let's discuss the concept of supply. Imagine that the price of ice cream is high. This means that selling ice cream is very profitable. The profit from selling a unit of ice cream is very high in relation to the cost of producing it. What would happen in this circumstance? What would this do to the supply of ice cream? What would sellers of ice cream do? Well, they'd want to supply a lot of ice cream for purchase, so they'll make and offer more ice cream for sale. New sellers might even come into the market because they now know how profitable it is to sell ice cream, so it might be worth their effort. Imagine the converse, that the price of ice cream goes down. What would this do to supply? Well, if you were a seller of ice cream, you'd be wanting to supply less of ice cream. And you might even think about shifting your capital into other industries where profit margins are higher, if that was feasible for you to do. Now, what happens to price in this context? What happens to price when the supply of ice cream increases? Well, when there's more ice cream, the price is going to decrease. Prices will decline, they'll get lower until they're low enough to get enough people to buy the increased supply. So the law of supply says that people will attempt to sell more of something if profits are high. Let's consider the concept of demand now, another key concept for neoclassical economists. Imagine that the price of ice cream is low, say at 20 cents a scoop. What would this do to demand? What would buyers of ice cream do? Well, they'd probably want to buy more ice cream. Maybe they'd even put some additional tubs of ice cream in the freezer by pre-purchasing. Imagine the converse. Imagine that the price of ice cream is very high, say at $20 per scoop. What would this do to demand? Well, we'd be wanting less, wouldn't we? We wouldn't be wanting to buy as much ice cream at that price. So what does this mean for the relationship between demand and price? What happens when demand for ice cream increases? Well, when demand for ice cream increases, price increases. Prices increase until they're high enough to stop there being a shortage of ice cream. And the law of demand then says, well, people will buy more of something if the price is lower than if the price is higher. Let's touch on the relation between supply and demand and the concept of equilibrium now. So as the price of ice cream rises, more and more sellers will produce and sell ice cream. and more buyers will stop buying. As the price of ice cream decreases, more and more buyers will begin to buy ice cream. But equally so, more and more sellers will stop selling, and they might try and move their capital to other industries that are more profitable. And this happens until a balance is reached between supply and demand. Economists call this balance an equilibrium between supply and demand. This is the price at which the quantity demanded, is exactly equal to the quantity supplied. If you'd like to go through this again for yourself at the end of the lecture, have a look at the YouTube clip, and you'll be able to find a link on the LMS as well. Let's provide a concrete example now to check our understandings. I'm going to provide you with two tables. The first specifies what ice cream sellers will supply to the market overall. Imagine that at $9 a litre, if ice cream sellers can sell their ice cream for $9 a litre, then they're going to be willing to supply a lot of it, 500,000 litres. But if they're only going to be able to get $5 for that litre, they're going to be only wanting to supply a smaller amount because the profit margins are not so good. As for what consumers of ice cream will buy in the market overall, let's imagine that at $9 for the price of ice cream at a litre, consumers are not going to be buying a lot because it's very expensive. But at $5 a litre, they're going to be buying a lot more, aren't they? So what does this mean for the equilibrium price, do you think? Have a little look at those tables and try and work out what you think the price equilibrium would be, where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. What do you think the answer is? This, by the way, is called a market clearing price, or the price at which there is no shortage or oversupply. Well, the answer is $7. At $7 a litre, the quantity that sellers will be willing to supply is 300,000 litres, and that's also the quantity that consumers will be willing to buy at $7. And so that's the market clearing price at which supply and demand have reached an equilibrium. Neoclassical economists like to depict the relationship between supply, demand, and price as if they are lawful relations. Here we have a graph that shows a shift in demand. Imagine you're wanting to buy an iPad. You have the price of the iPad along one axis and the amount sold on the other. Imagine that more and more people want iPads. At $600, people are wanting a lot of iPads. So they come to the market and demand goes up for iPads. But because there's higher demand for the iPads, the price rises. More iPads end up being provided at that higher price. And we have a market clearing price now, not of $600, but of $700. And we also have a larger quantity of iPads sold. Now, if we think of the example from the earlier slides of the effect of the old poor laws and the new poor laws on the price of children, the neoclassical economists would have said that the old poor laws and the new poor laws, to a lesser extent but still working in the same way, end up reducing the price of children because you can qualify for public charity or institutionalized charity or welfare on grounds that you have an additional child. So the price of children goes down. What happens when the price of children goes down? Well, people demand more children, the idea is. And so public or institutionalized charity artificially raises the amount of children that poor people have beyond the natural amount that they would have otherwise had without that institutionalized public charity. And so Marshall and others tend to find that, or claim that, child subsidies or family allowances, child allowances, can aggravate poverty by increasing the number of children by the poor that the poor have, by in effect lowering the price of children. Things are a little bit more complicated than that, to be sure, but that's the way, broadly speaking, the idea. That's broadly speaking what their idea is. What does this mean for the distribution of income? Well, the neoclassical view tends to be that the price or wage that a worker receives for their labour, the distribution of income, is equivalent to what their work contributes to the market value of the final product. The market gives a price for one's work as a function of whether employers want that work and whether workers are willing to supply labour for the price that employers are offering in the various industries in which work is available. We can see the difference between the two ways of conceptualising the value of labour and its contribution to economic life if we compare a Marxian approach with a neoclassical approach. Marx would say from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. Whereas the neoclassical economists would say from each according to their preferences and ability, to each according to their contribution. To understand why, we need to understand briefly the idea of factors of production. And again, this will be already quite familiar to those who have already studied first year economics and Pol 1 PPE. The factors of production are those elements that permit an individual or business to produce something. And neoclassical economists define them in the late 19th century as land, labour and capital, more recently expanded to include entrepreneurship. If you take our ice cream example, the production of ice cream requires land for a factory, labour or workers to make the ice cream, and capital like machinery, ingredients, freezers and the truck to carry the ice cream to the market. And capital is defined as those goods that can be used in the production of other goods. This is what makes it a factor of production. It can also be defined as goods made by humans, in contrast to resources like land, naturally occurring resources like geographical locations and minerals. So we've got these factors of production: capital, land, labour. Each of them are to receive a price that represents their contribution to the value of the final product, according to the neoclassical account of economics. So this neoclassical idea is that each of these factors of production, land, labour and capital, receive a price that reflects their contribution to the market value of the finished good. So rent or mortgage reflects what the land contributed. Wages reflect what the workers contribute. Only in terms of what employers are willing to pay for it, for sure, not in terms of the value of the labour itself, as in the labour theory of value, but just in terms of what employers are willing to pay. And then there's the ice cream maker's profit, a reward for the capitalist for contributing capital. That reflects what the ice cream maker's capital contributed. So basically, the idea is that the wages workers receive are simply a reflection of the value of what the workers contribute to the final product. If capital profits are too high and wages too low in one industry, workers will choose to move from one industry to another to benefit from higher wages. This will cause a shortage of labour in the first industry, and that will increase the price for labour in that first industry until you receive a market clearing price, an equilibrium between the supply of the labour and the demand for it. And the distribution of income is in this sense understood by the neoclassical economist simply as a function or an effect of supply and demand. As mentioned, these were ideas that were first developed in the 19th century, the late 19th century, not just by Alfred Marshall, but by others, by Menger, by William Stanley Jevons in Britain, by Léon Voras in France and Switzerland, and by Pareto across France, Italy, and Switzerland. So now we're in a position to summarise the response of the early neoclassical economists to their problem as they conceptualised it. We recall that the problem was how to achieve a science of motives that also explained and responded to the social ills accompanying early industrialisation, and that did so in a way that overcame or that avoided the incorporation of controversial or problematic ethical value judgments. Now we can state their answer. The social ills were conceptualised as caused by poorly conceived government policy, institutionalised charity, which prevented the market from spontaneously distributing rewards, income, share of consumable goods and so forth, in a manner commensurate with the contribution of the workers to the value of the final product. So these social ills were actually caused by governments choosing to respond to destitution, because institutionalised charity or welfare decreased the price of children for poor families, incentivising them to have more children that they could really afford to feed. And so Voras, Pareto, Marshall and Jevons all advocated in favour of overturning institutionalised public welfare. Welfare shouldn't respond to destitution at all. One should incentivise responsibility and merit. Note that we're back with a kind of Malthusian view. Destitute families are responsible for their own poverty. But there's also an evolutionary faith written into most neoclassical economics that the market incentivises good behaviour, rational behaviour, so that poverty will self-resolve. And we see this in Alfred Marshall's explicit response to Thomas Robert Malthus. Malthus, you might recall, had argued for a relation between population production and poverty. And Malthus had thought that poor families who made bad decisions about how many children to have needed, if you like, to suffer the effects of that if their contribution to production was not enough to allow them to sustain their families. Marshall agrees with this view, but is more optimistic. He thinks his analysis of the behaviour of families shows that families were already beginning to limit their reproduction in ways that allowed them to increase their standards of living thanks to increased wages under industrial conditions. Also due to the increased productivity of families. So there was a faith that people would spontaneously respond rationally if they didn't have institutionalised welfare to rely on as a prop. So that's their answer, if you like, and the early neoclassical economists believe this response to be avoiding the sorts of ethical value judgments that their predecessors in classical political economy and Marxian political economy had inadvertently incorporated into their accounts. My argument in my book is that the idea of withdrawing welfare and not responding to destitution itself involves a social and political position about how to manage poverty, which is deeply ethical in nature. Interesting. interestingly, although I have located the birth of neoclassical economics in a social and political problem of family impoverishment in the late 19th century under industrial conditions where urban poverty became of concern for economists, not agrarian poverty. Even though I've located this clearly in a social and political moment, you can see how neoclassical economists laid stake to the ahistorical and universally applicable nature of their theories. They thought this could be divorced from context. And this is in part why the approach became formulated in a number of different countries with different institutional conditions at different moments in the history of industrialisation. We've looked in part one at how neoclassical economists conceptualised their problem. We've looked in part two at how they responded to this problem with a new methodology and theories and policies. Now we can ask in part three some critical questions. Who gains the most from a theory that advocates in favour of free markets and that understands economic behaviour as an outcome of rational choices subject to budget constraints of time and income? Well, the neoclassical economists would say that everyone does. Cooperation in a market to buy and sell is voluntary and it serves mutual interest. Other scholars have argued that it is mostly those who already had a first mover advantage in the marketplace that disproportionately benefit. Next week, Veblen will argue that pecuniary emulation is such that those with purchasing power, the Victorian elite, were able to organise production to satisfy their own consumption preferences. Working class consumption was not a focus of the neoclassical economists at this time. They were still focused on production, industrial production. Not only that, Veblen will argue that pecuniary emulation or conspicuous consumption is invidious and socially harmful, in part because there was very little for working class families to consume in the late 19th century economies. Families were still making their own clothes, producing at home a lot of the products that we now purchase from markets. So who gains the most? Those who had first mover advantage in the marketplace, and this is visible in very concrete ways. Who loses? Well, the neoclassical economists would say that no one loses. Cooperation is voluntary. People can buy, people can sell as they choose. People can choose to offer their labour for a wage. Employers can choose whether to employ and how much to pay. This is good for everybody, it says. No one loses. Other critics have pointed out that this often leads to an acceptance of racial, gendered and class hierarchies as a reflection of the choice of those involved or inherent desert. So, for example, Emma Griffin, although Emma Griffin is a historian who's looked at autobiographies of working class and other families in late 19th century Britain. And she argues that in her first book that you can see that there was increased social mobility, particularly for men at this time, and massive increases in standards of living. But in her second book in 2020, she shows that the effects of increases to the wage, to the male breadwinning wage, allowed increased male independence that hadn't been seen before in agrarian economies, but in newly industrialised economies, this increased male independence had the effect of increasing male alcoholism, male leisure time, male unwillingness to work consistently, domestic violence, sexual assaults, family impoverishment, and abandonment of families by men who then had their own independent wage. And so we see that the theories as formulated did not think about the effect that this had on women and children who were left abandoned. And there was an acceptance of these gendered hierarchies in this case as a natural outcome of the workings of markets, with little attention to how to manage them, until Eleanor Rathbone would come along and rethink things. Does it matter? Well, scholars have suggested this leaves little place for moral judgments about fairness and desires for equality. Neoclassical economists would say instead, in response to that a division of labour is needed, with economists to be concerned merely with allocative efficiency, and politicians, democracy, and us to deal with moral concerns about fairness and equality. Feminist economists would say, yes, it does matter. Economists should be helping to think through the constraints that lead women to have lesser outcomes in markets. And queer economists will also think similarly, looking to the effects on non-traditional families and the distribution of economic outcomes through higher costs of having children or higher costs of healthcare and so forth. So it does matter. And if it does matter, we need to think through it, right? As for other criticisms of the neoclassical approach, it has been argued that the extension of economic rationality to domains of activity that were previously viewed as non-economic in nature can be problematic. Although Hirschleifer, from your readings, supports the extension of economic rationality to choices like the decision to love or to marry or to have children, he also notes some of the popular criticisms of this view. Self-interest seems inappropriate for behaviour like love or looking after children. These seem to be motivated by interest for the well-being of others. Many decisions also seem to be irrational, reflecting emotion, passion. We seldom act as the neoclassical economists believe we do. Stephen Keen takes this still further. Neoclassical economics cannot purport to be a science if its very axioms, instrumental rationality, optimizing rationality and the like, are unrealistic. Interestingly, neoclassical economics as a framework based on the assumption of agents, households, businesses, individuals, being rational and deciding rationally subject to constraints of time and income. This idea has been remarkably adept at changing itself to accommodate criticism. So we'll find when we look at other later competing schools of political economy that many of them emerge out of criticism with the early neoclassical approach, but never entirely divorce themselves from that framework. So behavioral economists, although they criticize the idea of agents choosing rationally because they, on grounds that people rarely behave rationally in real life, behavioral economics still can be viewed as an offshoot of neoclassical thinking, where now the science of incentives is a science of studying how people behave in real situations empirically. Similarly with environmental economics, neoclassical accounts of decision making have been used to try to explain why environmental harm should be priced into the cost of goods that are otherwise being sold too cheaply. Even neoclassical versions of feminist economics, known as gender neoclassical economics, have used modified utility maximisation and rationalisation models like non-cooperative bargaining to try to explain lesser divorce outcomes for women, and where these lesser outcomes are a result of budget constraints of time and income, explaining then a woman's choice to accept that lesser outcome, or to explain a woman's choice to care rather than to contribute to market labour. Some neoclassical queer economists have also explained lower economic outcomes for non-traditional families in terms of the higher costs associated with having children for non-traditional families, or the higher costs of having gender-affirming healthcare relative to heterosexual families or cis persons. Lee Badgett has modified and used neoclassical economics to try to explain injustices in the distribution of economic outcomes in the having of children and in healthcare, using a neoclassical framework. And we'll be able to look at those models and theories in later parts of this course. Next week, we'll return to our historical perspective to look at institutional political economy and how background institutions inform choice in ways that render the idea of a rationality more complex than depicted by neoclassical economists. And really, that's it for today. We look forward to seeing you this week on Tuesday for a discussion of the material. And next week, we'll turn to institutional political economy. Thank you.